My name is Jeff Maynor, here with Boundary Title. I've been dealing in residential real estate since 2007, so right after I graduated law school. Been doing it ever since. I really enjoy doing it. I love seeing the joy of people buying a house, be it their first one or their 15th one. There's always an excitement in getting that process handled. When you do a title search, are there actually issues that arise? Is it worth getting one done? Yes, there are several title issues we are able to fix. There could be errors in public records. I'll review title work and see a deed that was done previously, and it could have anything as small as a misspelling to errors in the legal description. We'll see errors in the notary on it, where there are certain notaries used for certain type of transactions, and if the wrong one is used, that needs to be fixed because it's defective. Other things we run into, there can be undiscovered liens on the property. So we go through these probate records. Are there any liens on the property? And if there are, those need to be paid off and satisfied before we make the transfer, because that new buyer does not want to inherit that. It's another example, though, of why title insurance is very important, because if there is a lien that did not get filed for public record, but then happens to show up later, title insurance will protect that buyer from having to be responsible for somebody's previous lien that they had nothing to do with. There are bad actors around, unfortunately, in any type of field, and real estate is not excluded from that. We see people who will do forgeries. So go through and just totally forge a deed, and it ends up they'll file it for public record. And if you don't have the protection of title insurance, that homeowner could be the one who's defending, trying to say, hey, I really thought that I owned this property, which you probably did, but somebody came in and forged something, and that needs to be litigated basically to make sure that you're protected. Another thing that we run into as they're dealing with estate properties. So if somebody dies and their heirs go and sell the property, got to make sure that all the heirs are accounted for. If there's a missing heir or something like that that is not discovered, and the property transaction is completed, and then that missing heir all of a sudden shows up and says, hey, where was my money for what we did for this when my brother sold this house? That's another thing that title insurance will protect too, to go through and make sure if some missing heir happens to be just show up out of the blue. Another issue that we do run across too when dealing with these transactions, and after we do a title search, there could be errors in previous surveys or boundary disputes or something like that. It's very common. So the question I get a lot from especially realtors, and then sometimes buyers as well, is if it's even important for them to get a survey themselves. Just a brief history, but surveys used to be required by lenders for every transaction that they were going to finance. Then what ended up happening is title insurance companies said they would cover survey risks. So at that point, lenders decided that they were not going to require the surveys, for every transaction. That made people get a little complacent and saying, if it's not required, then we're not going to get one. And for the most part, they're not needed. Most properties we're dealing with nowadays are in subdivisions. They've been platted. Those plats are public record and they're accurate. Things to look out for, though, is if you are buying property and there have been improvements that have made, big sheds or something like that, or pools that have been installed, then it's always wise to get a survey to make sure that those improvements are not encroaching on somebody else's property. It's a lot easier to get those things fixed beforehand than afterwards. That's just the thing on surveys to look out for, and just to have peace of mind going forward. A recent story when a homeowner went and built on their property without knowing exactly what their boundary lines were or their setbacks. It was actually a purchaser that I had, who had bought the property, had not gotten a survey, had just assumed where his boundary lines were and assuming that there were no setbacks on his property, which there were for this community that he was in. But he decided to go ahead and build an extremely expensive brick and wrought iron fence around the perimeter of his property. And so he had the fence done, spent I can't tell you how much on completing this project, and then the property owner adjacent to him, who had bought the property after this guy had built the fence, he did his own survey and realized that half of that fence was encroaching on his property. So this turned into a big headache. In the end, this gentleman had to pay to have half of his fence torn down and moved back 15 feet to satisfy the seller whose land he was encroaching on. So another kind of the stories we don't like to hear, but a good example of why it's good to know exactly what you own, especially before you start building on it.